In today's game, we see Bobby Fischer take on the best of Japan. His opponent is Yukio Miyasaka, and this was played at the Olympiad in 1970. Now, as many of you know, chess is not that big in Japan. Shogi or Go are more popular games. I think one of the reasons Westerners are fascinated with Japan is because so many things there are different, religion and so forth, than they are in the West. But there are some strong chess players in Japan. Bobby's opponent was rated around 2250 FIDE, according to my research. So there's a big gap here. Bobby, this is 1970. He's probably playing the best chess in the world. He probably has become, at this point already, the best player in the world. But it's still very educational to watch someone strong play someone else who also is strong, but not quite as good. The strategy is much clearer and easier to understand. Miyasaka has white in this game. Fischer has black. Let us jump right in. E4, C5, the Sicilian defense. After knight F3, D6, we quickly have Bobby Fischer's favorite defense, the Najdorf Sicilian, with this distinctive move, A6, keeping a piece out of B5 and preparing his own queenside expansion. Bishop to E3 from white. Later, this would become common. It would commonly be followed by the moves F3 and G4, the so-called English attack. That is not what white has in mind in this game. And Bobby Fischer, he could play E6, but he plays the move E5, creating more space in the center, competing with white for space. And after knight to B3, we see this, what's called the Boleslavsky pawn structure, and everything sort of revolves around this key D5 square. White wants to keep this pawn stuck on D6 and use this as a pivot point or a strong point for his pieces. Black wants to control it and then at some point maybe advance D6, D5 and liquidate in the center. Bishop to E7 from Fischer, bishop to E2, and bishop to E6, which shows that Bobby was a little ahead of his time. In more recent years, the move short castling has been seen as something of an inaccuracy because white can play the move G4 and attack fairly quickly. So Fischer delays that smartly. Bishop to E6 is played, again, trying to create some strength on D5. Castles, and now knight B to D7. He could have castled here, but he chose not to. F4, this move is often used to advance and push this bishop away in an attempt to exchange it off. Rook to C8 from Fischer, placing his rook on the half-open file. And as one of the common tactics in the Najdorf and also in the Dragon Sicilian is to play an exchange sacrifice to grab that knight and then later use the knight on F6 to take on E4. H3 is played. I'm not exactly sure the idea behind that move, to be honest. Fischer goes ahead and expands with B5. Now he's threatening B4, kicking away the knight, which is the only defender of E4. So A3 is played. This is a bit too slow. Modern computers definitely prefer the move A4. So after B4, white can just jump into D5. And if black grabs that pawn on E4, then just after bishop to A6, white is in good shape. He's got this past A pawn and is doing well. But A3, that's sort of a tempo, free tempo for Fischer. He uses it to castle, although he could do that exchange sacrifice we talked about earlier. But he castles. Queen to E1. Now knight to B6. This knight could jump into C4. It could jump into A4. Fischer's play is going to be on the queen side, so he's going to want to break open some lines over here if he can. And here Miyasaka makes a move. I'm not sure about it. He goes ahead and he takes on E5, and this helps Fischer eliminate some of his weaknesses. Maybe move like knight to D2, rearranging the knight and adding a defender to E4 was better. But now Fischer's weakness on D6 is gone, and it is white that is in fact saddled with an isolated E-pawn, whereas Fischer has two healthy pawn chains. So strategically, that was definitely good for black. Queen to G3 from white, putting some pressure on E5, but also there are some tactics where the bishop comes to H6 because there's a pin on the G7 pawn. Fischer plays a very strong move here. Knight to A4, really building the pressure on the queen side. Obviously, this rook is putting some pressure on C2. Now, Fischer's not that concerned about the health of his queenside pawn structure. He wants to open up lines of attack on the queen side. He doesn't mind if those pawns are out of the way. Queen to E5, and he does leave his pawn hanging, but after, say, bishop D6, queen to D4, bishop to b3, cb3, knight c3, bc3, and then he has this strong idea, bishop to c5. That would have been really strong, because after queen takes d8, he has the intermezzo, bishop takes e3 check, and that wins a piece. And that is one of the dangers if white goes ahead and takes on e5. So instead, he plays rook a to d1, obviously opposite of Fischer's queen, but that allows Fischer to play a strong move. He ignores the threat against his queen and instead takes on c3. Why? Well, because if white takes the queen, then knight takes bishop, check, and he gets white's queen. He forks the king and the queen after king h2, knight g3. He is very quickly up a lot of decisive material, a piece and a pawn. So that forces white to retake the knight, and now look at the pawn structure. Totally devastated, and also the pawn at e4 is also isolated. Fischer has gotten everything that he wanted. He plays queen to c7, defending e5, and also hitting the c3 pawn. Now bishop to h6, this idea that we were talking about where you pin the g7 pawn and threaten mate on g7, but that is easily thwarted. Fischer plays knight to e8. That defends g7. Rook to d3. That defends the c3 pawn. Maybe he can activate the rook on the f-file later. But king to h8. That removes the pin. And now Fischer's threatening to take the bishop that's at h6. So now the bishop has to move back. And it goes back to its original square at c1. Bishop to c4. Hits the rook. The rook has to move. Knight to d2, and this is the threats are beginning to cascade here. Fischer plays knight to f6, aiming at this undefended e4 pawn. If he were to take it, he would also be forking the queen and the rook. So queen to f3 defends the pawn, but now queen to c6, adding a second attacker to the pawn. Bishop to d3, adding another defender, but now Fischer's able to press. He takes that bishop, and there's just no good way to recapture. If white takes with the rook or the queen, then the e4 pawn would fall. Rook d3, knight takes e4 was played in the game. If he takes with cd3, obviously he would lose this c3 pawn. So rook takes d3, knight takes e4. Fischer has gained a beautiful central pawn, and just look at this pawn structure. Really, really nice. Knight to a5 hits the queen. The queen goes to g6. That keeps the knight defended. King to h2. This avoids checks from Fischer's bishop on the c5 square. f5. Now, bishop to b2 is played by white, but this is a time for a fantasy position. Let's ask ourselves a question. The question Fischer seemed to ask himself. What's the best square for this bishop that's at e7, and how do I get it there? And Fischer determined that the best square was f4, taking advantage of all these weak light squares and aiming right at white's king. So he plays bishop to g5, with the bishop coming into f4 with check. Rook f to d1, bishop to f4 check is played. If he plays king to g1, then queen to b6 check is a double attack, hits the king and hits the knight. He couldn't do that earlier because this knight on e4 was hanging, but now that it's defended, this threatens to win a piece outright. So king to h1 to stay off that dark square. But then knight to g3 check. Obviously, if he goes to g1, the knight is small potatoes now. He can play e4 and fork the queen and the rook and still maintain his threats. And if he takes with the queen, that's even worse because, boom, knight to e2 check, another fork that he has to watch out for. So because of that, he goes to h2, opening himself up to the discovery of the bishop. And then knight to h5 check, and in this position, Yukio Miyasaka resigned because after he deals with the check, then e4 is coming, and this bishop is protected, so he's going to lose a whole lot of material. So really, a game that was unbalanced, obviously, in terms of the abilities of the two players, but very educational, and it's interesting to see how Bobby played against a player from Japan, a place he later lived, I believe, for a while. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.